Hydesville. The Story of the Rochester Knockings. By Thomas Olman Todd. Chapter 1. The birthplaces of the greatest of the world's social, political, and religious reformations have generally been of insignificant and lowly aspect, and apparently under the most inauspicious circumstances for producing any great effect upon mankind. The babe of the lowly manger becomes the spiritual king of millions of human hearts and souls, and the wood hut becomes the gateway through which holy ministers of light, from their world of truth and beauty, send the evidence of man's immortality, through the instrumentality of a child, to the weary-worn pilgrims of earth, who, praying for the touch of a vanished hand, and the sound of a voice that is still, welcome with joyful hearts the spirit message we still live. The scene of the manifestations dealt with in the following pages was a small wooden homestead, one of a cluster of houses like itself, in the little village of Hydesville, near to the town of Newark, Wayne County, New York, being so called after Dr. Hyde, an old settler, whose son was the proprietor of the house in question. The place, not being directly accessible from a railroad, was lonely and unmarked by those tokens of progress that the locomotive generally leaves in its track. Hence it was the last spot where a scene of fraud and deception could find a possibility of a successful execution. The house was a humble frame dwelling fronting south, consisting of two fair-sized parlors opening into each other, east of these a bedroom and a buttery or pantry, opening into one of the sitting rooms, and a stairway between the buttery and the bedroom leading from the sitting room up to the half-story above and from the buttery down to the cellar. This humble dwelling had been selected as a temporary residence during the erection of another house in the country, by Mr. John D. Fox, who, with his family, soon afterwards became so prominently identified with the phenomena which have since become world-famous. Their little dwelling, though so small and simply furnished as to leave no shadow of opportunity for concealment or trick, was the residence of honest piety and rural simplicity. All who ever knew them bore witness to the unimpeachable character of the good mother, while the integrity of the simple-minded farmers who were father and brother to the sisters who have since become so celebrated as the Rochester Knockers stands proved beyond all question. The ancestors of Mr. Fox were Germans, the name being originally Voss, but both he and Mrs. Fox were native-born. In Mrs. Fox's family, French by origin and Rudin by name, several individuals had evinced the power of second sight. Her maternal grandmother, Margaret Ackerman, who resided at Long Island, had frequent perceptions of coming events. So vivid were these presentiments that she frequently followed phantom funerals to the grave as if they were real. Mrs. Fox's sister also, Mrs. Elizabeth Higgins, had similar power. On one occasion, in the year 1823, the two sisters, then residing in New York, proposed to go to Sodus by canal. But one morning Elizabeth said, "We shall not make this trip by water." "Why so?" her sister asked. "Because I dreamed last night that we traveled by land, and there was a strange person with us. In my dream, too, I thought we came to Mott's Tavern on the beech woods, and that they could not admit us because Mrs. Mott lay dying in the house. I know it will all come true." "Very likely indeed," her sister replied, "for last year, when we passed there, Mr. Mott's wife lay dead in the house. You will see. He must have married again and he will lose his second wife." Every particular came to pass as Mrs. Higgins had predicted. Mrs. Johnson, a stranger, whom at the time of the dream they had not seen, did go with him. They made the journey by land and were refused admittance into Mott's Tavern for the very cause assigned in the dream. The family of Mr. and Mrs. Fox consisted of 6 children, but at the time of the manifestations the house was occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Fox and their 2 youngest children only. Margaretta, aged 12, and Kate, aged 9 years. These details, insignificant as they may now appear, are due alike to the family and posterity. When the future of this wonderful movement shall have become matter of history and antiquity, if not reverence for spiritual truth, and shall induce mankind to follow the example of their ancestors and label the records sacred, the names now sunk in obscurity and masked by slander may perchance be engraved in monuments of bronze and marble, and the incidents now deemed too slight for notice become reverenced as Holy Writ. These changes of chance and time have happened before. If history repeats itself, they will occur again. It was reserved to this family to be the instruments of communicating to the world this most singular affair. They were the ones who first, as if by accident, found out that there was an intelligence manifested even in the rapping, which at first appeared nothing more than an annoying and unaccountable noise. In a publication of the early investigations connected with this house, entitled, "A Report of the Mysterious Noises Heard in the House of Mr. John D. Fox, in Hydesville, Arcadia, Wayne County," authenticated by the certificates and confirmed by the statements of the citizens of that place and vicinity, we find that some disturbances had affected the house before the Fox family came to live there. In the year 1843-4, the farm was occupied by a Mr. and Mrs. Bell, who, during the last 3 months of their stay, were joined by a young girl, Lucretia Pulver, who sometimes worked for them, and at other times boarded with them and went to school, she being about 15 years old. According to the statement of Lucretia, called forth by subsequent investigations, a peddler called at the house one afternoon whom Mrs. Bell seemed to recognize as an acquaintance. He was a man about 30 years of age, dressed in a black frock coat, light trousers and vest, and carried with him a pack of goods containing dress material and other draperies. Shortly after the arrival of the peddler, Mrs. Bell called the girl to say that she could not afford to keep her any longer, and that as she was going to the next village the same afternoon, she might pack her clothes and they would go together. Before going, Lucretia chose from the peddler's pack a piece of delaine, asking him to leave it at her father's house. This he promised to do the next day. Mrs. Bell and Lucretia then left the house. The peddler and Mr. Bell remained behind, the former apparently having decided to stay there for the day. The peddler did not call at Lucretia's father's house next day in fulfillment of his promise to do so, nor, in fact, was he ever seen again, a circumstance which should be borne in mind when the sequel to this story is under consideration. About 3 days afterwards, much to the girl's surprise, Mrs. Bell sent for Lucretia to return to her again. She did so, and from that time she began to hear noises and knockings in her bedroom, the same room which was afterwards occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Fox. On one occasion, when Mr. and Mrs. Bell were away from home at Loch Berlin, and Lucretia had to remain in the house, she sent for her young brother and a girlfriend named Aurelia Losi to stay in the house with her. During the night they all heard noises which they declared sounded like the footsteps of a man passing from the bedroom to the buttery, then down the cellar stairs, traversing the cellar for a short time and then suddenly stopping. They were all very much frightened and got up to fasten the doors and windows, but were scarcely able to sleep the remainder of the night. About a week after the visit of the peddler to the house, Lucretia, having occasion to go down into the cellar, stumbled and fell into a hole filled with soft soil. This somewhat frightened her and caused her to scream for assistance. Mrs. Bell coming to her rescue, Lucretia asked what Mr. Bell had been doing in the cellar that it was all dug up. Mrs. Bell replied that the holes were only rat holes, and a few nights afterwards Lucretia observed that Mr. Bell was busy for some time in the cellar filling up the rat holes with earth which he carried there himself. During the remainder of the period in which the house was occupied by the Bell family, the sounds continued to be heard, not only by Lucretia but by Mrs. Bell. Lucretia's mother, Mrs. Pulver, was a frequent visitor at the house, and on one occasion in particular, after the foregoing events, when she called upon Mrs. Bell, she found the latter quite ill from want of rest, and on inquiring the cause, Mrs. Bell declared she was sick of her life, and that she frequently heard the footsteps of a man traversing the house all night.